Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back. Welcome back, all you citizens of the world, and thanks for listening in to Live from the Heartland for the week of March 7th in the year 2025. This show used to be broadcast directly from the stage at the Heartland Cafe, and one of the people who was involved then, even before I was, is the next guest, the one and only Paul Draus. He's not only the former host of Live from the Heartland, he is a professor of urban sociology at the University of Michigan in Dearborn. And he was last on our show just before the election in November, talking about how things looked up there. And I'm going to ask him a little bit about that. But we're also going to talk to him mostly about his new book called Forging Identity. And it's about a fellow named Carlos Nielbock. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Someone he met in Detroit. And he met this fellow while encountering his creations. And these creations, they spin, they shine. They loom over the street where he resides, like the sun. Anyhow, going on and on, but it's about this guy, Carlos Nielbock, who came from Germany, a mixed race heritage, and his life in Detroit. So hello to you, Paul. I hope I didn't mess up too much on that introduction.
No, that's great. I'm good. Good to see you both. Or good to see
you. Well, how are things politically up there? Last night, we're recording on a Wednesday just before the weekend, and the current president spoke last night and basically did a campaign rally and badmouthed a lot of things and told a lot of lies. I'm just wondering what your take might be on that and how that might relate to the Arab and Palestinian community around Dearborn, that some of them went for Trump, and that probably wasn't a good thing in their own interest. Your take on that?
Yeah, well, I'm a resident of Dearborn, Michigan, and I was involved in the campaign, door knocking and so on. From a citizen's perspective, I wasn't a campaign official or anything like that, but I was volunteering in the get out the vote efforts in the last month or so. And I think the last time we talked, we were in the midst of that. So, it was reflecting back on it. We could sort of see the way the wind was blowing. I think with the local population, kind of two main impressions. One was just that, people were just devastated and angry about Gaza and felt really betrayed by the Biden administration. And so I think people expressed that in a variety of ways. Some people voted for Trump. A lot of people voted for Jill Stein, or they just didn't vote, right? And so you saw that in the outcome where, Joe Biden had won Dearborn by significant margins, I think, and Trump ended up winning the plurality of votes in Dearborn, although I think Jill Stein got 16%, something like that. So, that's clearly the difference between Harris and, Harris probably got in the 40s. I think, there has been some buyer's remorse, and there's been some coverage of that locally in terms of, Trump campaigned as a peace candidate. He was going to bring peace to Gaza and Ukraine. And looks like, he will bring peace, but not necessarily the kind of peace people wanted. Because if everybody's removed from then that's another form of peace, right? But I don't think people are sitting here going, well, I wish we had voted for Kamala Harris, because I don't think Kamala Harris gave them much either to hang on to, from the sort of Arab and Palestinian perspective. From a Democratic perspective, like everywhere else, I think Democrats are trying to figure out, what to do or how to respond with this sort of onslaught, coming from the White House. And I will focus on one bright spot here, who's my congressional representative, Rashida Tlaib. And I don't think we've seen a lot of big public moves from Rashida, but my last night before the election, I spent on the phones at Rashida Tlaib's office, where we were getting out the vote for Rashida as well as for Kamala Harris. And Rashida won by significant margins. She's a fighter, she's a winner, and she I think is a model for what maybe the Democratic Party needs to be and needs to do. She's very in touch on the ground. She's a very hands-on grassroots, someone who comes out of organizing communities. And although she's primarily identified in the national media as, as a Palestinian American, which she is, the first Palestinian American to sit in the U.S. Congress, she's known here as a community-based advocate. That's what she's known for. So people aren't voting for her primarily because of her ethnicity. People are voting for her here because they know she stands up for working people. She's been a fighter against, pollution, again, for wage equality, all sorts of issues here. So that to me is one of the bright spots to think about, in terms of where we go from here.
Well, we like a bright spot. And one of the things that, while you were talking, it occurred to me that as a professor at University of Michigan, Dearborn, you might be getting affected by the Trump regime's DEI changes, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know that DePaul University, where I've been teaching, has been hit with a lot of letters from the government telling them what to do, and I'm not sure if they've been very good on it. I need to investigate that. I wonder, as a professor, how you see it, and has it affected the University of Michigan at Dearborn and beyond?
So, I mean, we've gotten some notes from our administrators saying that they're watching this very closely. They're trying to abide by, kind of the letter of the law to whatever extent is required. And I think, as faculty, people are wondering where and how we're actually going to push back, because, some of the stuff that's being demanded, I think, is just unconstitutional. I mean, it's basically, policing of speech when you get right down to it. But I mean, as far as what I'm doing, it hasn't really changed it on a day-to-day basis. But again, it's very early. So a lot of these things are still rolling out and filtering down. So we won't really know the full outcome for a while. I know in terms of the money, like a lot of this freezing of funding from like the NIH and the NSF and stuff like that does have a big effect on universities, but not just in places like Michigan, in places like, Alabama and Florida and Texas, all these places where people are doing, medical research, 98% of which is totally not only non-political, but totally, non-sociological. It's mostly is biomedical, research that's being done with those dollars. So I think there's going to be pushback from a lot of different places. So, I think we won't know again for a while what the final outcome will be. Right now, they've been, I think, it's just sort of trying to be cautious and read the tea leaves as they sort of shake out.
Well, we're going to talk more about this over the next few weeks with some other professor types. But one of the things that I wanted to have you do today is to tell us about your new book. You have a new book called Forging Identity, and it is about an interesting person you met in Detroit. There's a picture of it, and we'll put it up a few times. And what I was really, really glad to see, I only looked it over a little bit in the digital copy, but it includes your drawings. So this fellow, Carlos Nielbock, is that how you say it?
Yeah, Nielbock. That's correct.
Nielbock. He's someone you encountered. I guess he does sculptures, and he has these towering iron gates, flashing windmill blades, cut the sun into shards against the backdrop of a hot pavement and green cloaked stillness that was the east side of Detroit. And you've known him since, I think, 2012. Why don't you start to fill us in, and we'll talk a little bit about the book.
Yeah, so this was a book that was almost kind of like an accident in the sense that, we met Carlos in the process of working on another project. I was with a colleague of mine. We were doing kind of neighborhood-based interviews on the east side of Detroit because a lot of things going on in that neighborhood. And we were trying to understand kind of like a community level viewpoint of different changes taking place there. And so we kind of stumbled on his place of work, which is also his workshop and his residence, where he has these windmills. So the spinning shapes you see there on the book cover, that's a view from the rooftop of his building on the east side. He created these windmills out of old satellite dishes and old streetlight poles and a lot of other upcycled, recycled materials that he salvaged from sort of the urban environment. And this was, in the really the depths of the Great Recession, he started doing this. And he's a skilled metal worker by trade who came from Germany in the early 1980s to Detroit, really speaking no English at all, looking for his father, who was a black GI who had been stationed in Germany, in the 50s and early 60s, and had met his mother. And that's how, Carlos came to be, right? Carlos and his younger sister. But he didn't really know his father growing up, because his father was once the military found out that he was having this relationship and had kids with this white German woman in this small city in Germany, he was basically, relocated back to the States. And he said that the military basically shit canned all his requests to reunite with the mother of his children and so on. And so Carlos grew up basically without knowing his father, went to find his father in the early 80s when he was in his 20s, and found him on the east side, and ended up basically staying and making his career on the east side of Detroit doing this metal work, which he had learned in a monastery, in like an old Catholic monastery in Germany, which was basically like an alternative high school for young people who had behavioral issues. So he'd been sent there almost for disciplinary reasons, but he ended up finding that he was really drawn to this work of shaping metal and really had a gift for it. And so this began this sort of lifelong mission to, not only to share this gift, to use this gift and to share this gift. So he brought that to Detroit. And so the book is really told as this kind of almost like a Don Quixote type heroic narrative of this sort of individual on this journey, right? And all along the way, he kind of knocks his head against obstacles and always kind of gets up and comes back, fighting again, even though, there are aspects of his character that lead him into, difficult situations as well. So it's kind of like a character study, but it's also a book about the city of Detroit, and also about the history of race and racism, of the complexities of identity, and how this young man, had to decide or figure out who he was. First of all, growing up in Germany as, a mixed race, so-called mixed race child in, all white Germany. And then finding his way in Detroit, where basically he was viewed not as a local, not viewed as black either. He wasn't viewed as either black nor white. He was sort of this kind of in-between type of character with this German and then his German accent and his, he has green eyes, but darker skin, but not dark. So, I mean, he's sort of an ambiguous figure. And so the book also deals with this sort of journey of his, of kind of finding out who he is. And at some point, he also discovers African metalwork, and he begins collecting this bronze work from the Benin area of Africa. So he has this tremendous collection of bronzes and metalwork from Africa, and all this knowledge, because he's kind of like a self-educated person, right? So he's a guy who has this encyclopedic knowledge of this metalwork and its meaning and so on. So part of his sort of mission in life has also become to try to educate people around him, what he calls the bronze people of Detroit, the people who are the descendants of, of that same western part of Nigeria where this metalwork originates from, to connect them with this heritage of greatness that's there. So it's a story that has a lot of different layers to it, and also has to do with the redevelopment and revitalization of Detroit and who's included and who's excluded. So I think there's a lot of different things to chew on, and it's got the drawings in there. It's not quite a comic book, but it is written in a way to be accessible to the everyday reader.
Well, I'm really I like the sculpture aspect to start with. I came out of hot rod cars in the 50s and did a bunch of metal sculpture, finding old things like man in his works. a reciprocal process toward dehumanization, which was a guy with a meat grinder head on a unicycle with his arms chained to the unicycle. And I did a lot of that kind of stuff while I was studying anthropology and doing sculpture. Um, I'm wondering what really possessed you to turn this into a book. You met him, you liked his windmills, but you took it further. You decided you're going to make a book out of this. And it's your second book. Your first book was about tuberculosis on the west side of Chicago, way back in the days when you were finishing your PhD at Loyola. How did you end up coming to write this book rather than some other sociological fable?
Well, I actually have another sociological book that I had written or was writing before I started this one, and that one is still not published. It's hopefully going to be published soon, but this kind of started as like a side project because I've been doing this stuff with Carlos. I started doing projects with him, around these windmills and things. And the windmills really emerged out of this moment of the Great Recession where he was this guy with his main bread and butter is doing fine metal restoration, like in old buildings and things like that. But a lot of this business dried up in the Great Recession. Nobody was spending money on anything like that. So he basically started working with materials around him, and he saw this idea, this opportunity for green energy, with the Obama administration and all these things talking about investing in green energy and so on. So he's like, I can make windmills. I grew up in Germany. I saw windmills all around me, the great Western tradition of the American windmill. I'll make windmills. And that way, this will be sort of my link into this new economy, this new green economy. And so the sort of sculptural part of the windmills kind of emerged out of that. And so Carlos is he's a great talker and storyteller. He's full of ideas. So we would have these conversations, right? Sometimes arguments too about different things. And as I got involved in these projects with him, I became almost like a de facto project manager, like a general contractor where I wrote a proposal to be able to study these windmills in terms of their sociological impact. But then I ended up kind of managing the job where I'm like talking to the concrete guy and I'm talking to, the city, trying to get the city inspector to show up and all this different kinds of stuff. And then we ended up going to like these junkyards looking for parts. And so I really spent a lot of time with him, especially in the 2018, 2019, all through the summer, going on these kind of like adventures with him and having these long conversations. So as I learned more in depth about his background and his life, I started seeing how this could be like a longer story. And that's when it started developing. And then I just sort of built it out like piece by piece, these different chapters of his life and his story, but also connecting each one to different sort of themes that I saw in terms of basically the sociology of it.
Let me jump in here and what is the sociological impact and how does his story kind of relate to the devastation and then the revitalization of Detroit?
So the windmills, which we ended up calling basically the Detroit windmill because it was made from these local materials, out of local ingenuity in the spirit of Detroit's industrial, past. The idea of it was what Carlos will say is that, the real green energy is the stuff that you make, with materials you have yourself. So if you're buying solar panels that are all made in China, you're still dependent on, sources outside of your own environment. And so like the real green energy, he would say, is what you make from the water, like, the water turbine at the Henry Ford estate near where I live, or windmills, the windmills that would be used to turn, massive grinding stones and things like that. And so basically his kind of dream or vision was if we could come up with a product or a strategy for creating energy with materials and labor that all exists around us, we create our own economy, right? And we're not having to be dependent upon the economies, of largesse or of charity or of just trying to get like a contract here, a contract there from a corporate investor or something like that. So there's this idea of kind of connecting local ingenuity and training young people who are being left behind in this school system that we have to find their place like he did, to find their passion and to be able to make a good living and feed their families and create an economy locally that could help to rebuild the city of Detroit using local labor and local materials and building on this sort of great tradition and the ingenuity that we've inherited, not only from the sort of industrial side of American history, but also the ingenuity of the immigrant past, the African immigrants, the German immigrants, whose skills were utilized in order to build these great buildings that are still around us every day.
How did you pick the title, Forging Identity?
This is something called AI. No, we kicked around a lot of different titles, and Carlos was like, "Well, just put the book through like a ChatGPT and see what it spits out." It spit out a bunch of stuff. Actually, this title I think was one the publisher suggested. My original title was "Wind in the Weeds," because it had to do with how when we originally met Carlos and these windmills were spinning above these sort of weedy fields on the east side. But Forging Identity really seemed to fit because it was, he is a metal worker. And he's creating things, but he's also creating himself in a way. So it's like sort of finding who he is, but also it's the identity of Detroit. What does the identity of Detroit consist of, And he insists that it consists of all these elements, this multicultural heritage, right? All these things have contributed to the greatness of this city that is Detroit, and we need to build off of all these things as we move into the future.
Paul, speaking of Detroit, there's an event coming up this weekend in Detroit. So some people may, if they're watching this or listening on Friday or Saturday, they could still make it, or people up in Detroit. Tell us what's going on. I'm not sure I have the information right, but I think it's something to do with the Ford Hunger Marchers. You fill us in.
Yeah, so we have an event, and also we'll say one more time, Forging Identity, Michigan State University Press. You can buy it directly through the press, or you can also buy it from your local bookseller. I won't give the name of that other company that you might go to.
Yeah, good.
So we've been doing this event for, I think, almost 10 years. We call it March On because it takes place in March every year around the anniversary of the 1932 Ford Hunger March, which took place on March 7th, 1932. So where you had thousands of unemployed workers march from Detroit to Dearborn to demand concessions from Henry Ford at the Ford Rouge plant. And 5 workers were killed in a confrontation with armed police and security at the gates of Ford Motor Company. And so this became a catalytic event in the formation of the labor movement, the auto workers movement. The UAW had not yet formed at that point. They formed in 1937, a few years later, and Ford had been, of course, vehemently opposed to any unions in his plants. So we started doing this event because we created a park on the site of the original gathering of the 1932 Ford Hunger March, which is on the Rouge River at the Fort Street Bridge. So it's called the Fort Street Bridge Park. We were able to get a park built there that includes a monument to the 1932 Ford Hunger March. So every year we do this event, we honor the history and we commemorate the history of this event and the sacrifice of these workers. We also use it as a way to focus on the importance of protest in our society up to the current day and including the current day, like people protesting and demanding a better life. And so we use it to both commemorate that history, but also to celebrate and inspire those who are doing that, in the present. So of course, this year we feel like it's a especially appropriate time to be talking about this history and the necessity sometimes of it just takes people going out and making those workers didn't, they weren't like, some of them were full-time activists, but a lot of them weren't. They were just people that in the depths of the Great Depression, they're like, we've got to go and we've got to demand something better for ourselves. And that's the only way change is going to come about.
And that's what we have to be doing.
Yeah, so it's Saturday, March 8th. We meet at the Fort Street Bridge Park at 10 a.m. We're going to clean up the park a little bit. We're going to do some sing-along with some labor singers. Then we're going to march up the road. We're going to follow the route of the original Ford Hunger March to Local 600, a UAW Local 600 in South Dearborn. And then we're going to have a performance of the jazz opera Forgotten, which is about a murder that took place at the Ford Rouge plant in the 1930s. And then we'll have some rock band led by a sort of a radical labor lawyer that we know here, and some comedy. And then we'll have beer and food and celebration. So, and we're hoping Bernie Sanders shows up. So if you know any Bernie people, we're trying to get him to come out because we know he's going to be in Detroit this weekend.